Let's start by clearing up one of the biggest misconceptions people have about emotional strength. Most people think emotional regulation means suppressing what you feel. They believe it's about staying calm on the outside while there's chaos on the inside. That's not power, that's pressure. And pressure, if left unmanaged, always finds a way to leak out. Sometimes in anger, sometimes in anxiety, sometimes in the quiet breakdowns no one sees. Real emotional regulation is something far more sophisticated. It's the ability to experience your emotions fully without becoming controlled by them. It's the space between stimulus and response. And in that space, there's choice. That's where your power lives. Think about it when someone says something that triggers you. What usually happens? The body reacts first. Your heart rate shifts, your breathing changes, your nervous system goes into defense mode. Before you even think, you're already reacting. And if you're not aware of that process, you'll call that reaction truth. You'll say, this is just how I feel, as if feelings are facts, but they're not. They're signals. And signals are meant to be interpreted, not blindly obeyed. Emotional regulation is about learning how to read those signals without immediately acting on them. It's the difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is automatic. Response is intentional. Reaction is driven by past conditioning. Response is guided by present awareness. This is where most relationships break down. Not because people don't care about each other, but because they don't know how to manage what they feel in the moment it matters most. One person gets triggered and lashes out. The other shuts down. And now you're no longer dealing with the present situation. You're dealing with two nervous systems trying to protect themselves. But imagine if in that same moment, you had the ability to pause, not to suppress, not to avoid, but to observe, to say, I notice I'm getting activated right now. That single moment of awareness changes everything. Because now, instead of being inside the emotion, you're in relationship with it. And when you're in relationship with your emotions, you can start asking better questions. What am I really feeling here? Is this about what's happening right now? Or is this connected to something older? What does this emotion need from me reaction or understanding? That's where regulation becomes transformation, because you're no longer trying to control your emotions or learning from them. You're using them as data, not directives. And here's the deeper truth. The more you practice this, the less reactive you become, not because you feel less, but because you understand more. Your emotional world becomes less chaotic and more coherent. You don't lose intensity, you gain clarity. This is what creates stability in your life and in your relationships. Because when you can regulate yourself, you stop outsourcing your emotional state to other people. You're no longer dependent on someone else's behavior to feel okay. And that's the beginning of real freedom. So emotional regulation isn't about becoming numb. It's about becoming precise. It's about having access to your full emotional range without losing control of your direction. And when you master that, you don't just change how you feel, you change how you live. Because the moment you learn to pause instead of react is the moment you stop being ruled by your emotions and start leading your life. Now, once you begin to understand emotional regulation, something else starts to reveal itself, and this is where the work gets deeper. You begin to notice that certain situations don't just bother you, they activate you. They hit something disproportionate. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A change in tone feels like abandonment. A little distance feels like loss. That intensity is not random. It's patterned. What most people call overreacting is often a nervous system recognizing something familiar. Not familiar in the present, but familiar from the past. Your mind may be focused on what just happened, but your body is responding to what it has learned to expect. This is why triggers are so important. They are not inconveniences, they are information. They point directly to the places within you that have not yet been integrated. When someone triggers you, your first instinct is usually outward. You want to correct them, confront them, or withdraw from them. But if you pause and turn inward instead, a different question emerges. Why did this affect me so strongly? That question shifts you from blame to awareness. And awareness is where transformation begins. Because the truth is, most emotional reactions in relationships are not just about the current moment. They are layered. They carry memory, meaning, and interpretation that has been built over years, often starting in early attachment experiences. If at some point in your life, your emotional needs were not consistently met, your system adapted. It learned strategies, anxiety, avoidance, hypervigilance, not because they were ideal, but because they were necessary. And those strategies don't just disappear when you enter a new relationship. They come with you quietly, automatically, until something activates them. So when you feel that surge of jealousy, fear, anger, insecurity, it's not weakness. It's history surfacing in real time. But here's where people get stuck. They treat the trigger as the problem instead of the doorway. If every time you're triggered, you focus only on changing the other person, you stay trapped in a cycle. Different partner, same reaction, different situation, same emotional outcome, because the source hasn't been addressed. Real growth begins when you start using triggers as a mirror. Not a mirror that shows you something is wrong with you, but a mirror that shows you something is unresolved within you. And that requires a different kind of honesty. The kind that says, this reaction feels familiar. I've been here before. The kind that separates the present event from the past imprint. The kind that takes responsibility not for everything that happened to you, but for how you choose to understand and respond to it now. This is not about self-blame. It's about self-awareness. There's a difference. Blame keeps you stuck in judgment. Awareness moves you into choice. Because once you can see the pattern, you're no longer unconsciously repeating it. You can interrupt it. You can question it. You can begin to respond in ways that are aligned with who you are now, not who you had to be then. And this is how secure attachment is built, not by avoiding triggers, but by transforming your relationship to them. By recognizing that every emotional spike carries a message, and that message is asking to be understood, not silenced. Over time, something powerful happens. The same situations that once overwhelmed you begin to feel manageable. The same triggers lose their intensity. Not because the world changed, but because you did. You stopped reacting from old wounds and started responding from present awareness. And when you reach that point, your triggers no longer control you, they guide you. As you start to recognize your triggers and understand the patterns beneath them, a deeper shift begins to take place. You realize something that most people spend years avoiding. The security you've been seeking from others is something you have to learn to generate within yourself first. This is where the conversation around attachment fundamentally changes. Because most people enter relationships with an unspoken expectation: if I find the right person, I'll finally feel stable, valued, and safe. And it sounds reasonable. But in practice, it creates dependency, not security. Why? Because if your sense of safety depends on someone else's consistency, attention, or mood, then your emotional state is always at risk. You're stable only when they're stable. You feel connected only when they're present. And the moment something shifts even slightly, your system reacts as if something essential is being taken away. That's not secure attachment. That's emotional outsourcing. Secure attachment doesn't begin when someone else shows up perfectly. It begins when you stop abandoning yourself in the moments you need stability the most. It's built through an internal process of validation, regulation, and self-trust. Think about what happens when something feels off in a relationship. For many people, the immediate impulse is to reach outward seeking reassurance, clarity, or control. And while communication is important, there's a difference between expressing a need and relying on someone else to regulate your internal state. If you haven't developed the ability to calm your own nervous system, to sit with uncertainty, to process your own emotions, then even the healthiest relationship will feel unstable. Not because it is, but because your internal foundation isn't steady yet. This is why two people can be in the same relationship and experience it completely differently. One feels grounded, patient, and secure. The other feels anxious, doubtful, and reactive. The difference isn't always the partner, it's the level of internal security each person brings into the dynamic. Building that internal security requires a shift in how you relate to yourself. It means learning to validate your own emotions instead of immediately questioning or suppressing them. It means developing the capacity to soothe yourself instead of demanding that someone else fix what you're feeling. And it means trusting your ability to handle discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. This is not about becoming independent to the point of isolation. It's about becoming stable enough that connection becomes a choice, not a necessity for emotional survival. Because when you no longer need someone to complete you, you can actually relate to them more honestly. You're not driven by fear of loss or desperation for closeness. You're grounded. You can communicate clearly. You can set boundaries without guilt. You can give without overextending and receive without suspicion. And paradoxically, this is what creates deeper connection. Not neediness, not overattachment, but presence. Two people who can stand on their own emotionally and choose to come together create a relationship that feels safe, not suffocating. This is the essence of secure attachment. It's not about finding the perfect partner. It's about becoming a person who can create emotional stability regardless of external conditions. And once you reach that point, something shifts. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop fearing distance. You stop interpreting every change as a threat, because you know that no matter what happens externally, you have the ability to return to yourself. And that's the real definition of security knot, that someone will never leave, but that you will never abandon yourself. Once you begin building that internal stability, something very noticeable starts to change in your behavior and, more importantly, in your energy. You stop chasing. Now, let's be precise about what chasing actually is, because most people misunderstand it. Chasing is not just calling someone first or putting effort into a relationship. Chasing is the emotional state behind the action. It's when your behavior is driven by anxiety, by the need to close a gap you're afraid of, by the urgency to secure reassurance before you lose it. It's when your mind starts racing. Why haven't they replied? Did I do something wrong? Are they pulling away? And before you even realize it, you're acting from that state, sending another message. Over-explaining, trying to fix something that hasn't even been clearly defined yet. From the outside, it looks like effort, but internally, it's dysregulation. And here's the part most people don't want to hear. Chasing rarely creates closeness. It creates pressure. Because when your actions are fueled by anxiety, the other person doesn't just hear your words, they feel your state. And pressure, even when it's subtle, often leads to distance. This is especially true in dynamics where one person leans anxious and the other leans avoidant. The more one chases, the more the other withdraws. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because the intensity feels overwhelming to their nervous system. So the instinct becomes counterproductive. The very thing you do to create connection ends up weakening it. This is why the shift from chasing to grounding is so critical. Grounding is not about withdrawing or playing games. It's about returning to yourself before you reach outward. It's the ability to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it externally. When you feel that urge to chase, that's your signal. Not to act faster, but to pause deeper. You ask yourself, what am I actually needing right now? Is it clarity? Is it reassurance? Is it connection? And then the next, more important question. Can I meet some part of that need within myself first? This is where emotional regulation and secure attachment start to integrate in a very practical way. Instead of acting from the peak of emotion, you regulate your state. You slow your breathing. You step back from the narrative your mind is creating. You give your system time to settle, and something interesting happens in that space. The urgency begins to fade. What felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What felt like a crisis becomes a situation you can actually think through. From that grounded state, your actions change. If you choose to communicate, it comes from clarity, not fear. If you choose to wait, it's not out of suppression, but out of confidence. You're no longer trying to force a response or allowing space for a real one. And this shift doesn't just change how you feel, it changes how you're perceived, because grounded energy is different. It's calm, it's steady, it's self-contained, it doesn't demand, it invites, and people respond to that very differently than they respond to urgency. Over time, you begin to trust this process. You realize that you don't need to chase connection to maintain it. What's aligned will meet you halfway. What requires constant pursuit often isn't stable to begin with. And this doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become intentional. You act when it's appropriate, not when it's triggered. You express when it's clear, not when it's chaotic. This is how you step out of reactive patterns and into self-leadership. You're no longer pulled by every emotional wave. You're grounded enough to choose your direction. And when you reach that point, the dynamic shifts in a very real way, because you're no longer trying to hold the connection together through effort alone. You're allowing it to exist through balance. And the moment you stop chasing what feels uncertain is the moment you start attracting what feels stable. As you begin to ground yourself and step out of reactive patterns, your perception of what actually creates connection starts to evolve. Many people are conditioned to believe that strong relationships are built on intensity, on passion, emotional highs, dramatic reconciliations, and moments that feel overwhelming in their depth. And while those experiences can feel powerful, they are often mistaken for stability. Intensity is not the same as security. In fact, intensity without regulation often creates unpredictability. One moment, everything feels perfect. The next moment, everything feels uncertain. That emotional volatility can become addictive because the contrast between high and low creates a kind of psychological loop. But over time, it erodes trust. Not because there isn't connection, but because there isn't consistency. And without consistency, the nervous system never fully relaxes. This is where the idea of secure attachment requires a fundamental shift in values. Instead of asking, how strongly do I feel about this person? The more important question becomes, how safe do I feel being myself with this person over time? Safety doesn't come from grand gestures or occasional emotional intensity. It comes from patterns. It comes from knowing that what you experience today is not going to drastically change tomorrow without reason. It's built through small, repeated actions that signal reliability. Consistency is not exciting in the way intensity is, but it is stabilizing. And stability is what allows intimacy to deepen. Think about it from a psychological perspective. The human nervous system is constantly scanning for predictability. When something is consistent, the brain categorizes it as safe. When something is erratic, even if it's positive at times, the brain remains alert, waiting for the next shift. So if your experience of a relationship is built on unpredictability, great connection one day, distance the next, your system doesn't settle. It stays engaged in a cycle of anticipation and reaction. And that cycle prevents true emotional security from forming. This is why consistency is not just a behavioral trait, it's an emotional signal. It communicates without words. You can trust this space. And trust in its simplest form is built on what is repeated. It's built on showing up when you say you will. It's built on communicating clearly, even when it's uncomfortable. It's built on responding rather than disappearing. It's built on emotional steadiness, not perfection. Because perfection isn't required for security, reliability is. This also applies to how you show up. Secure attachment is not just about choosing consistent people, it's about becoming consistent yourself. If your behavior changes based on your mood, your fears, or your assumptions, then you unintentionally create the same instability you're trying to avoid. But when you regulate your emotions and align your actions with your values, something shifts. You become predictable in the best sense of the word. Not boring, but trustworthy. Not rigid, but stable. And that kind of presence allows the other person to relax. It creates an environment where honesty feels safer than performance, where communication feels easier than avoidance. Over time, this consistency compounds. It builds a foundation that doesn't rely on constant reassurance or emotional spikes to feel real. The relationship becomes less about managing uncertainty and more about deepening connection. And here's the paradox. When safety is established, the need for intensity decreases, but the depth of connection increases, because now you're not relating through emotional extremes or relating through clarity, trust, and presence. That's what allows a relationship to sustain itself beyond the initial phases of attraction. That's what creates something that doesn't just feel good in moments, but works over time. So the goal is not to eliminate emotion or passion. It's to anchor it in something stable, to create a dynamic where feelings can exist without destabilizing the connection. And when you begin to value consistency over intensity, you stop chasing emotional highs and start building something that actually lasts. As all of this comes together, your ability to regulate your emotions, understand your triggers, ground yourself instead of chasing, and value consistency over intensity, something begins to shift at a deeper level. Not just in how you feel, but in how others respond to you. Because whether people realize it or not, we are constantly teaching others how to treat us. Not through what we say occasionally, but through what we consistently allow, reinforce, and embody. Most people try to change relationship dynamics through words. They explain, narrow and justify, they ask for different behavior. And while communication matters, it has very little impact if it's not supported by emotional congruence. If your words say one thing, but your behavior and energy communicate something else, people will respond to the latter every time. For example, you can say you value respect, but if you tolerate inconsistency, overextend yourself, or abandon your own boundaries to keep someone close, the message that actually lands is very different. It says, this is acceptable, not because you said it, but because you demonstrated it. This is where emotional regulation becomes more than an internal skillet, becomes a relational standard. When you're regulated, you don't react impulsively to discomfort. You don't collapse into fear when something feels uncertain. You don't overgive to secure connection, and you don't withdraw to protect yourself from vulnerability. Instead, you respond with clarity, and clarity creates boundaries, not aggressive boundaries, not defensive walls, but grounded, consistent limits that reflect self-respect. The kind that doesn't need to be constantly explained or enforced through conflict, because it's embedded in how you show up. When something doesn't align, you address it calmly. When a pattern repeats, you don't ignore it, you respond to it. And if necessary, you adjust your level of access, not as punishment, but as alignment. This is where many people struggle because they associate boundaries with rejection or loss. They think that if they hold their standards, they'll push people away. But what actually happens is more precise than that, you filter out dynamics that were never aligned to begin with. And what remains, or what comes in, is different, because people don't just listen to what you say, they calibrate to what you tolerate. If you tolerate inconsistency, you'll receive inconsistency. If you tolerate emotional unavailability, you'll experience distance. But when you embody regulation, self-respect, and clarity, you set a different baseline. And people either rise to meet it or they naturally fall away. This is not about control. It's about alignment. You're not forcing anyone to change. You're creating an environment where certain behaviors no longer fit. And that environment is shaped entirely by your internal state and your external consistency. Over time, this changes the entire dynamic of your relationships. You no longer feel the need to chase, convince, or over-explain. You don't get pulled into cycles of confusion or mixed signals because you've become anchored in something stable. You know what you're available for and what you're not. You know how to communicate without losing yourself. And most importantly, you trust your response more than you fear someone else's reaction. That's where real confidence comes from, not from controlling outcomes, but from being grounded in your own standards, regardless of what happens. And when you operate from that place, respect becomes a natural byproduct, not something you demand, but something that emerges from consistency. Because at the end of the day, people don't learn how to treat you from your words, they learn from your patterns. And the standard you live by is the standard you receive. So when you step back and look at everything we've explored, you start to see the full picture. Emotional regulation is where it begins the ability to pause instead of react, to observe instead of be consumed, to create space between what you feel and what you do. Without that space, you don't have choice. And without choice, you don't have real control over your life. Then you start to recognize your triggers. And instead of treating them as problems, you begin to see them as signals. Not proof that something is wrong with the other person, but information about what still needs healing within you. That shift alone changes the direction of your growth because you stop projecting and start understanding. From there, you realize something even deeper. Secure attachment was never something you could borrow from someone else. It has to be built inside you first. You stop looking for someone to stabilize you, and you start becoming someone who can stabilize themselves. And ironically, that's when relationships begin to feel safe or not, because others change first, but because you do. And as you ground yourself, you naturally stop chasing. You stop reacting from fear, from urgency, from that internal pressure to fix uncertainty immediately. Instead, you begin to respond from clarity. You learn that not every silence needs to be filled. Not every distance needs to be closed. And not every emotion needs to be acted on instantly. You start choosing your responses instead of being pulled by your impulses. Then something else becomes obvious. Intensity is not the same as security. You stop confusing emotional highs with emotional safety. You begin to value consistency, stability, and calm presence over unpredictable passion, because you realize that what actually allows love to grow is not chaos-ets reliability. It's knowing that what is true today won't disappear tomorrow without reason. And finally, you understand this simple but powerful truth. You are constantly teaching people how to treat you. Not through your explanations, but through your patterns, through what you tolerate, what you allow, what you respond to, and what you walk away from. Your behavior becomes the standard. Your consistency becomes the instruction. So when all of this comes together, the transformation is not just in your relationships, it's in your identity. You are no longer someone trying to secure love through anxiety, chasing, or overthinking. You become someone who leads with awareness, groundedness, and self-respect. You stop abandoning yourself in moments of fear, and you start standing steady in moments of uncertainty. And in that state, relationships don't become perfect, but they become clear. You know where you stand. You know who you are. And you know that whatever happens externally, you are no longer disconnected from yourself. Because the deepest form of secure attachment is not finding someone who never leaves, it's becoming someone who never leaves themselves. And once you learn that, everything else in your emotional life starts to reorganize around it.